the Europeans' failure to condemn what happened in Venezuela, it's going to come back and bite them because now Trump is like, okay, well, we'll just take Greenland from you. I think that it will happen. I don't think it necessarily will even be, it won't be like a military invasion. They will just go and just plant their flag there and say we have it. And what are they going to do?
Yeah, but there's 60,000 people live there. I mean, you could simply just buy them off. You could give each of them $100,000. That would be, what, $6 billion. It's just nothing for the U.S. And, and you have Greenland, right?
Right. Well, I mean, that's what he's talking about now, saying that we'll buy it. Do you think that could go through? I mean, obviously Denmark.
Well, obviously Denmark, to actually for a transaction to be legitimate, the other party has to agree to it, right? So if Denmark says no, and every indication so far is that they will say no, then you can't buy it. You can leave the money on the table, but that's not a transaction. Then take it, but that's just still theft, right?
Mm-hmm. So do you think he's going to take it? Everything is so crazy right now.
I know. I think so. I remember when it was first mentioned, I just thought this was some kind of joke. He's having fun with us, and then it became clear, after the second or third time that he was quite serious about it. And now I think he feels empowered. This is the problem. He can do anything, and especially in his own hemisphere. I'm sure dealing with the Russians and the Chinese in Eurasia is frustrating. You can't push them around. Obviously there were attempts to do that. The tariffs against China, and the various sanctions, and then the drone attacks on the oil refineries. We found out that even while he was, playing nice with the Russians, he knew that the CIA was helping, carry out these drone attacks on Russian infrastructure. But he thought it would give him leverage, but clearly it doesn't. The Russians are able to absorb the hits, which were minor, and then they have the air defense to eventually just shut it down, and they can also end up doing a lot more damage to Ukraine than the West can ever do to Russia, and with these kind of operations. So it's just frustrating for him. He just has a sense of his own impotence. But in the Western Hemisphere, he can be the God Emperor. And that's bad news for the Western Hemisphere and
the world, right?
I mean, for the world too, right? Because again, Latin America is one thing is it's not just Venezuela, but just Latin American countries have increasingly strong and important, vital economic ties with China. The trade with China has been growing rapidly, over the last couple of decades. And increasingly, China has become more important to them than the U.S., was. The U.S. used to dominate those countries economically, not just politically, but economically. But that's just not true anymore.
I just feel like this has to end in some type of massive war or, world war or something close to it. The amount of actions that we're taking, just think about all the other wars, how they start off. World War I, it was a political assassination, and then look what happened. I mean, it just takes one event, and then things start to spiral out of control. And we have so many events moving right now. I can't even keep track of it. I want to talk about Iran as well, but all this other stuff keeps on coming up that I'm just like, oh my goodness, now we're seizing Russian oil tankers. The CIA admits that it was involved in these drone attacks, and then we kidnap the sitting president of a country. We just kidnap, go in there, bomb the country, kill 80 people, and then just kidnap the president and his wife. And then and then the crazy thing is, I was saying as well that there's been so much that has changed, is that we're just very brazen about what we're doing. There's no idea that there's international law, and that we're admitting that the CIA is involved in attacks on Russia. But then with Maduro, we pretend that that we're following some legal process, that this was a law enforcement mission is what it was. That's what it was. And that he's going to court and he's going to be indicted. And
it'll be interesting. There's always a chance that the legal part of it will fail. It really depends on the integrity of this judge. Now, in my understanding, he's a very old guy. He's 92 years old. And I think he was the judge that actually oversaw some of the 9/11 cases. And now I know a lot of those 9/11 families actually were in the end very upset with him, because they felt like he decided to really side with the government and keep a lot of things secret, and they wanted them to be revealed. That's my understanding. But he's a he's a he's a judge with a long career, and clearly at the end of his career, where really nothing's to be lost, he might just decide, well, I'm just going to do the right thing. And the thing is, like within the U.S., there, especially within the established, let's say the academic and legal elite, there are a lot of Trump haters. There are a lot of people. He would be a hero, I think, overall within the legal community if he shut this down and freed Maduro. I think actually he would. The assumption that, oh, this is just going to be a show trial is a mistake. Maybe it will be. But there is still some independence in our judiciary. Trump doesn't always get what he wants. He has suffered some reversals in the courts, and it could happen here. We'll see. I don't know. It could go either way. Again, it's just like there's always this tendency, even among, fairly liberal or leftist judges, just to side with the government. But it's not a foregone conclusion that Maduro will be convicted. And that'll be an interesting part of the drama. Again, even when you have a general support for hegemony, there can be divisions, within the country over that. Just like in Israel, right? You have they're all Zionists. All the supporters of Israel are Zionists, but a lot of them hate Netanyahu, and so we got that ICC, warrant for his arrest. But it wasn't really a blow against Zionism. Unfortunately, it was just against Netanyahu. They wanted to have somebody else in charge of the Zionist project. And you could say the same thing. Again, it's just like, clearly the U.S. has been behaving as a hegemon, ever since the 1990s. And so there's not real opposition at all, any opposition within the establishment to the hegemonic project, to this, this notion of U.S.-dominated global order. But there are a lot of people that say we don't want Trump at the top of it. He's actually bad for our project. We want somebody else. So there is a chance again. I think that this legal case, which I understand is very flimsy and seems to have been very poorly thought out and may fail.
Yeah, I mean, if it succeeds, I think it's very damaging to the idea of a rule of law here in the United States. It just shows that it's right. Just, you just go after, these are political cases,
right.
Like if you're just on the wrong side, they'll go after you. It's kind of scary. It's starting to feel more Soviet, just.
Right. Well, yeah. Again, the thing is, like, we're pointing at Trump now for a good reason. We should be blaming him. But prior to this, it was the Democrats who were starting to use the courts, as right. a weapon, against lawfare against Trump. So it's part of I would say, an unraveling, a very sharp decline of American, of the American Republic, of the constitutional system that we have.
Yeah, just the rule of law. One thing that was in that indictment, or that wasn't in the indictment against Maduro, was the Cartel de los Soles, which was the whole thing that they were talking about. I heard it on the news all the time, that Maduro's the head of this drug cartel, and it's not even mentioned. So it just goes to show that it doesn't exist, if it does exist, it exists as a CIA construct.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is that it was actually a label put on just sort of an informal network in Venezuela back in the 1990s. There wasn't really an organization called Cartel de los Soles, but the CIA was working with those people. They actually oversaw a shipment of cocaine from Venezuela into the U.S., part of some operation, and they were actually told customs, let this go through. We have to, as part of our operation, trust us. And they just called these guys that they were working with Cartel de los Soles, but that organization didn't really exist. It was just an informal network. And then it just ceased to exist completely. And it became, but this phrase, or this label actually became sort of an inside joke. Like, journalists and others within Venezuela would say, he's a member of the Cartel de los Soles, which is, not that that organization existed. It was like saying he has his hand in the till or something. He's a corrupt guy. That's just what it became. It was a figure of speech. And now, but then it was incredibly, I think it was just a couple of days ago, even Marco Rubio mentioned the Cartel de los Soles. It's like, it's almost like saying, yeah, we hear that he's got the hand in the till. We're going to find that till, man, and we're going to go get it. It's just a figure of speech. It's just, that's the level or the depth of ineptitude and stupidity that we've reached here.
Right. But I mean, they labeled this cartel that doesn't exist as a terrorist organization, and it gives them this justification. It just shows you how they operate. They can say, oh, this is a bad man. Oh, we'll just make up some illegal crime syndicate, and then we'll say that he's the head of it, and we'll label this crime syndicate as a terrorist organization. And then so just you as even me, you told me like, it doesn't really exist. And I'm like, well, it's got to exist to some extent, right? It can't be complete, but it doesn't seem like it is, or else it would be in this indictment.
Right, exactly.
It does. It's just, it's insane to me that we're able to lie so comfortably, and that because there's so much faith, residual faith in the United States and its institutions. Even I have trouble coming to terms with just how brazen we are and how deceptive we are.
Right.
It's hard to imagine, but it's true. It seems to be true. That just you can't trust the United States with anything it says.
Yeah, no, unfortunately it's true. And the problem with that is that sometimes like it just becomes increasingly difficult to know what's true. Occasionally I'm sure the U.S. government speaks the truth, right? But you just start to develop this attitude that it must be a lie. And they've obviously lied in creating pretexts for other wars. This is not the first time this has happened by any means. This is the old playbook. But it just seems like it's been done particularly with spectacular incompetence this time. It's just the lies are just so very obvious. They were somewhat convincing. I think it's like people have become, increasingly cynical over time, myself included. I remember back in, prior to in the buildup to the Iraq War, I was still, really very naive. I was not convinced by the case, I have to say. And actually stated that, no, I didn't see that we had, any justification for an attack in Iraq. But I assumed that there was actually something to it, to these charges that were being made. I couldn't really believe that the whole thing was just completely fabricated. And then later I found out that it was. And that was, has led me to where I am. And I think a lot of people have gone on that same journey. We've become increasingly cynical. And now it's just like, if you believe these lies, you just got to be, just willfully stupid because they're just so blatantly obvious. Again, they didn't even do the homework to find out that the organization, that basically it's an inside joke now within Venezuela. It doesn't actually exist.
Well, the lies work. You say that you have to be stupid, but I think the reality is just that most people just don't really care too much about these issues, and then they just see and they just get a little. They're able to.
Right. I have to apologize. I want to say that people who believe it aren't necessarily stupid, but they're not paying attention. Let's just put it that way. And they are naive. They're trusting. They're not doing, I would say, their due diligence as citizens. You need to actually. I know we all have busy lives, but occasionally, especially if you're going to vote, you got to spend some time trying to make sense of these things. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to find out that this is total nonsense.
Yeah, I think so much of the American population, it's all just based on emotion. And the American people have just felt like everything's going to be decline and there's just loss after loss. China's beating us in the economy. Russia's winning in Ukraine. It just seems like America, we need a win. And I think they're just desperate to grab onto something that they can see as a win. And then this whole Venezuela story is painted as this is a bad guy that's sending drugs into your country. They don't ever read the indictment. They don't know that the Cartel de los Soles doesn't exist and that we went there and stopped them. And not only that, now we're getting billions of dollars worth of oil. So this is a huge win for America. America's back. We're reasserting military dominance and our economic strength here in in our hemisphere. as far as a lot of people compute. And so I think, like I said, one of the most disappointing things for me with this is just to see the American reaction, that the majority, it seems to me like the majority of Americans, a lot of them are like, okay, yeah, Trump wasn't doing good with stuff in the Middle East or whatever, but this, hoorah, this is our backyard, and we're showing that we still got it. And it's just been very disappointing to me. But at the same time, maybe I can ask you this question. Why is it that for me, all these things that are happening in Venezuela, in the Middle East, Russia, or China, Iran, these are so important and they're so fascinating, and they have huge implications for us all, but the majority of people just don't care. Why don't people care? Why don't people... It seems like people don't. I know we have busy lives. I'm very busy outside of these conversations as well, but I can't stop thinking about it. It's just always occupying my mind. I'm like, wow, this is the most fascinating story of our time. And most people are just like, oh my God, do you see what P. Diddy did? Or just, it's just, they don't care.
Well, maybe because you have these thrice weekly conversations with your dad.
Yeah, but we started doing these because I was interested.
Yeah. Well, I hope I planted a seed. I mean,
for sure you did. 100%.
Yeah, and I think one thing that sets us apart from a lot of American families is that we do have a lot of connections overseas and an interest in foreign countries, and I think that was part of your upbringing. It wasn't like any sort of political position was ever pounded into your head, but there was this awareness of a larger world, and you were encouraged to go out and explore it. A lot of Americans never leave the continent, or if they do, they just go on a cruise or something, and they're still in an American bubble. All of you were encouraged to learn foreign languages. I think all of that has an effect. You had your trip to Palestine, with my parents and their organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think one thing also that helped me is that I was never partisan. I've never voted in a presidential election. Part of the reason I was in China for most of that time. But even when I was here, for me, it just seems silly. It seems stupid. I kind of started realizing that you're choosing between Pepsi and Coke. People get angry, but for the most part, things don't really change, especially foreign policy wise. And so but here, so many people, they are just locked into a tribal camp. And I just find that odd. And I'm glad that I never was like that. And sometimes people will call me, based on our conversation, he's clearly a leftist, or he's clearly hardcore right wing fascist or something, But I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that we just on we have this sports football mentality, and part of it's like, okay, when we do something like in Venezuela, it's like, this is our home team, the United States took it, so hooray. Or we hate the Democrats, so whatever the right does is okay. Yeah, it's a huge problem.
Yeah, well, it's always been part of human societies going way back. Unfortunately, it's just this kind of primitive tribalism. It just happened. Even in I call it a primitive tribalism, but it exists as much, or maybe even more so, in very so-called advanced, high technology societies. It's just there. You just find it everywhere. Well, maybe you
Not
don't
in
find
China.
it. I was just going to say, because that's something you pointed out. It's maybe an unfortunate consequence of the kind of political system that we have. People. The idea, of course, is that you have a real debate, and you hear different sides, and then you get to choose. And maybe some people actually do that, but it just seems like instead what you have is these different tribes forming. It's like us, the blues versus the reds, and then especially with the current social media, the media landscape, that okay, the blues have their own media, and the reds have theirs. They live within their separate bubbles, and they just and if you're within the red bubble, the way to get to your clicks is to say, what you're supposed to say and who you're supposed to attack, and then there's the your opposite number on the blue side, and it just kind of there's never actually a debate in the middle. It just becomes this increasing polarization. Yeah, I guess, it's not, I guess I made a mistake. It is a common occurrence in human societies. It's true. But it doesn't happen to have to take the form that it's taking in our country now.
Yeah, liberal democracy just feels like a con game because it makes you think that like, okay, once I get my party in, that all problems will be solved. But all it creates is just this passing the buck from one side to the other, and nothing really changes. But in a system like in China, I feel like it's much more efficient because everybody's on the same team, and when the government's not doing something right, people will be upset, and they have to fix and respond to that. It's not like there's no feedback loop within the Chinese government that they're just like, okay, only everybody gets one bowl of rice and just sit in your factory for 15 hours a day. It's not how it works. If they implement a bad policy, there's repercussions for the officials that were behind it. And so there is an accountability mechanism built in the Chinese system, but there doesn't seem to be one in the United States. There's just no accountability for everything.
Right.
And we're just talking about, well, just saying like, we're talking about, we're going this whole idea of the rule of law, and that's why we had to take Venezuela. But we haven't seen anything about the Epstein files, where the arrests for there, the massive fraud in the United States, the Russiagate hoax, or the way we handled COVID and all this. Nobody gets prosecuted. You say you're about the rule of law, nothing happens. And then you just use it when you want to for some weird geopolitical game.
Right. Yeah. No, it becomes this partisanship, it in the end, it just becomes a distraction, right? It just said, okay, or it provides some sort of a false hope. You invest a great deal of energy in getting your team in power, and then you assume that that'll work out. It doesn't, and so then the other team takes it. It just goes back and forth. But you're right; the problems themselves never seem to be addressed.